I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. After weeks of exhausting work, I finally managed to book a quiet, secluded Airbnb cabin up in the mountains. It promised solitude, peace, and stunning views, perfect for a few days of unwinding. The reviews had been glowing, people raving about the tranquility of the area and the warm hospitality of the host. I didn't think twice when I saw the confirmation email. When I arrived, the place seemed perfect. The cabin was tucked away, nestled between towering pines, with only a narrow dirt road leading to it. The host wasn't there, but she had arranged everything perfectly, leaving a handwritten note with clear instructions on how to get settled. I texted her a thank you message and followed the directions, feeling an odd sense of anticipation. As I stepped inside, the smell of wood and pine greeted me, filling the air with a fresh scent that reminded me of my childhood camping trips. The interior was cozy, with just the right balance of rustic charm and modern amenities. It wasn't too far from civilization. There was a small village about 15 minutes away, but it was still remote enough to feel isolated. At first, everything felt right, but as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, I started to notice strange little things. The front door creaked oddly when I shut it, and the floorboards upstairs groaned, as though someone was walking around. I dismissed it as the quirks of an old house and settled into bed, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first night was restless. I tossed and turned, unable to get comfortable. It wasn't the bed. It was something else. The creaks in the house grew louder, sharper. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps animals outside. But then, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step on the stairs, followed by the sound of the door at the top of the stairs creaking open. I lay frozen in my bed, staring into the pitch-black room. My heart raced. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling, or maybe I was hearing things. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I reached for my phone, checking the time. 2:13 a.m. The house was still. Then a faint whisper, almost imperceptible but clear enough to send a chill through me, came from downstairs. Leave? No. I shot up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. The voice sounded like a woman's, but it was distorted, almost hollow. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, my hands trembling, and crept toward the stairs. Each step I took seemed louder than the last, my mind racing through every possible explanation, none of which made any sense. I reached the top of the stairs and froze. The door to the spare bedroom, which had been closed earlier, was now wide open. I could see the faint glow of moonlight filtering in from the window. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening to the silence. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow just outside the light. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't stay to find out. I bolted back to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I texted the host about the strange noises. She replied almost immediately, "Sorry to hear that. The house has a lot of character. Let me know if you need anything." I wasn't convinced. By the second night, I was beyond uneasy. I kept thinking about the shadow in the doorway and the voice from downstairs. But what unsettled me the most was the fact that I wasn't alone. That cabin, despite how isolated it seemed, crowded as though there were hidden eyes watching me. I decided to leave early the next day. I packed my things, half panicked, ready to head out and never look back. But just as I was about to call an Uber to take me to the village, something caught my eye, something I hadn't noticed before. On the kitchen counter was a small, old-fashioned notebook. It was leather-bound, aged, and looked out of place. I opened it, and the first few pages were blank. Then in the back were scribbled entries, faded but still legible. My heart skipped when I realized they were written by previous guests, people who'd stayed at the cabin before me. "Something follows you after the storm," one note read. I saw it. "You'll see it too." I flipped through more pages. There were other warnings, others who'd left the cabin in fear, mentioning shadows, whispers, and strange figures watching from the windows. but there was one entry that stood out among the rest. "She's coming for you." The air in the cabin grew colder as I read the words. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt the overwhelming urge to get out of there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, slammed the notebook shut, and rushed for the door. As I stepped onto the porch, I looked back one last time. The cabin looked different now, more sinister. The shadows seemed longer, darker, stretching toward me like fingers reaching out. I drove off, not stopping until I hit the main road, leaving the cabin behind. I've been home for 2 days now, but the feeling hasn't gone away. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shadow in the doorway. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I hear the whisper again. "You should have stayed." I work as a night nurse at a hospital on the outskirts of the city. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. Most nights are quiet, the kind of routine shifts where you get used to the beep of machines, the sound of distant footsteps in the hallway, and the occasional patient who needs attention. But that night, it was different. I clocked in at 10 p.m., already exhausted after a long week. The hospital had an eerie stillness to it that night. The usual hustle and bustle of doctors and staff felt subdued. The lights in the hallway flickered like they had a mind of their own. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the old building acting up. Around 2 a.m., things started to feel off. I was monitoring the patients on my floor when I heard it. The overhead PA system crackled to life. At first, I thought it was a glitch. The voice that came through was faint, distorted, and static-ridden. "Code red. Room 27, code red." My stomach dropped. A code red meant a serious emergency, something major. But room 207 was empty. It hadn't been used in weeks. I rushed to the nursing station to confirm with the other nurses, but they hadn't heard anything. They looked at me like I was crazy when I mentioned the announcement. "You sure you didn't just hear the intercom glitching?" one of them asked. But I knew what I heard. The voice wasn't a glitch. It felt too real, too urgent. I made my way to room 207, hesitant but compelled to investigate. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was cold, freezing cold. The window was closed, and yet the chill was almost unbearable. But that wasn't what sent a wave of terror through me. On the floor, right in the center of the room, was a small pile of clothes, blood-stained, but no body. I stepped inside, my breath visible in the freezing air. The pile of clothes in the center of the room looked old, faded with time, but the bloodstains were fresh. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to call security, but before I could dial, the overhead lights flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Then I heard it. A slow, ragged breath. Not mine. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the dimly lit room. The bed was empty, the machines unplugged, the curtains still. But in the corner, near the supply closet, a figure stood, motionless. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I focused, I could make out the shape of a person, tall, unnaturally thin, with its head slightly tilted, as if observing me. My chest tightened. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. The figure shifted, stepping forward. The moment its foot touched the tile, the PA system crackled again. "Help me." The voice was different this time. A whisper, a plea. Then the room erupted into chaos. The lights above flashed erratically, the heart monitors in the hallway beeped wildly, and from the closet, something banged violently against the door as if trying to break free. I bolted. I didn't look back as I ran down the hallway, my heart slamming against my ribs. When I reached the nurse's station, the chaos had stopped. The lights were steady, the machines silent. Everything was normal again, except for one thing: the security cameras. I checked the monitor for room 207, desperate for proof of what I'd seen. The feed showed only an empty room, no figure, no pile of blood-stained clothes, nothing. But in the final seconds of the footage, Just before the screen cut to black, I saw it, myself, standing in the doorway. And behind me, I didn't sleep after that shift. I barely made it home, my mind replaying what I had seen over and over again. The security footage, the pile of clothes, that thing standing in the corner, my own reflection with something behind me. I called in sick the next night, but something gnawed at me. I needed answers. Room 207 wasn't just another empty patient room. It felt like a void, like something had been trapped there for too long. So, against every instinct, I went back. This time I wasn't alone. I convinced a coworker, an older nurse named Linda, to come with me. She'd been at the hospital for over 20 years and had seen things she refused to talk about. When I mentioned room 207, she went quiet. "I used to work that floor," she finally said. "That room was shut down after an incident years ago. A patient disappeared from that bed one night. Cameras caught nothing. The only thing left behind was their clothes, soaked in blood." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Back in the hospital, Linda led me to the security office where she accessed old records. The name of the missing patient made my stomach turn. Michael Carter. I knew that name. He wasn't just a patient. He was an old EMT who had gone missing while on duty in this very hospital. The last place he had been seen? Room 207.8. As we stared at the file, the overhead PA system crackled again. Code red. Room 207.8. Code red. Linda and I looked at each other, fear locking us in place. Then the screen in front of us glitched. The live security feed of room 207 flickered, and for the briefest moment before the entire system crashed, we saw him, standing in the center of the room, staring at the camera. Michael Carter. His mouth moved, forming words we couldn't hear. Then the screen went black. I quit the next morning. I don't know if they ever opened that room again. I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night when I turn on my TV or switch stations on my radio, I hear it. A faint, static-laced voice whispering over the airwaves. "Help me." I had just moved into my new apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in an old building that had seen better days. The rent was cheap, the location was convenient, and honestly, it seemed too good to pass up. The landlord, Mrs. Archer, was a little strange, but she was sweet enough. She gave me a tour of the apartment before I signed the lease, explaining how the previous tenants had left in a hurry, but she didn't elaborate. There were small quirks about the apartment I couldn't ignore. The windows were sealed shut with no way to open them for fresh air. The hallway lights flickered constantly, and the bathroom had an old-fashioned lock on the door, one of those heavy metal ones you rarely see anymore. Still, I wasn't concerned. I chalked it all up to the building's age. The first night, I was woken up by an odd sound. It started soft, a quiet tapping, almost like fingernails scratching against the wall. I brushed it off, assuming it was a neighbor, maybe a pipe vibrating. But the noise didn't stop. It continued in a rhythmic pattern, persistent and unnerving. It seemed to come from the wall behind my bed. At first I tried to ignore it. I wrapped my pillow around my head, hoping it would stop. But then I heard something else. A voice, faint and muffled, but clear enough to make out. "Help me." I shot up, my heart pounding. There was no one there. The room was dark, silent, except for the sound of my own breath. The tapping had stopped. Maybe I was just dreaming, I thought. I tried to shake it off, but the next night it happened again. This time the voice was louder, more desperate. "Please help me, I'm stuck." I stood frozen in bed, too terrified to move. The voice seemed to come from behind the wall, from the very space I was lying in. I got out of bed, walked to the wall, and pressed my ear against it. The sound stopped, as though it knew I was listening. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was going on? Who or what was behind that wall? I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know. The next day, I couldn't focus. I went to work, but my mind kept drifting back to the wall, the tapping, the voice. I had to figure out what was happening in my apartment. After a restless shift, I came back to the apartment and stood in the hallway, staring at the spot where the sound had come from. It was the wall right behind my bed, a solid surface with no apparent cracks or signs of damage. I felt a strange pull to it, like something invisible was drawing me closer. I grabbed a flashlight from my drawer and got to work. The tapping hadn't occurred again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was just waiting for me to get too comfortable. I searched the room for any way into the wall, anything that could explain the sounds. There were no vents, no access points, just the wall, smooth and unyielding. But then I noticed something. At the base of the wall near the corner, there was a slight imperfection in the plaster, an area that seemed slightly more cracked than the rest. I ran my fingers over it. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I pressed harder, and to my shock, the plaster gave way, crumbling beneath my fingers. Behind it was an old wooden panel, barely visible. My pulse quickened. I pulled it open, revealing a small cavity in the wall. It was cramped and dusty, filled with forgotten objects, boxes, old furniture, bits of junk. But then my eyes landed on something in the back corner of the space. A figure. I froze. The figure was hunched, curled in on itself, almost like it was trying to stay hidden. The clothes it wore were old, threadbare, and covered in dust. My stomach churned, but I couldn't stop staring. There was something wrong with it. Something wrong about the way it moved. Before I could react, I heard the voice again. "Help me. I can't get out." I dropped the flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor, illuminating the space further. The figure shifted. Slowly, its head turned, revealing a face. But it wasn't a human face. It was distorted, stretched unnaturally. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, and then it smiled. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My heart raced and I backed away, my legs shaking. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't stop staring, its smile widening with every second. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I collapsed against the wall outside, breathless, shaking, unable to process what I had just seen. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it again, a low tapping. From the other side of the wall. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a blur. Was it some kind of hallucination, a cruel trick of the building, of my own fear? Or was there truly something trapped in the walls, something alive? I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. But before I could leave, I saw her, Mrs. Archer, standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. She was holding a set of keys in her hand, her eyes vacant, unblinking. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice almost too calm, too knowing. "Mrs. Archer, what's in that wall?" My voice shook as I demanded an answer. "Who's in there?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step forward, her face unreadable. Then, without a word, she gestured toward the apartment door with her keys. "I'll help you move out," she said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her expression was unchanged, but there was something in her eyes, something familiar about the way she looked at me. Before I could speak again, I heard the tapping, this time from inside the apartment, coming from behind the door, louder than ever. Mrs. Archer reached for the door handle, her fingers brushing it delicately. "It's been a long time since anyone stayed here, you know," she said, almost too gently. "Too long. But you were different. You were supposed to be different." Suddenly I realized Mrs. Archer wasn't just the landlord. She was part of this. Part of whatever dark history this apartment held. As if in response, the tapping behind the door grew louder, a frantic scratching sound now, followed by a muffled voice too distorted to understand. "No! Don't let me out! Don't let me out!" Without thinking, I bolted past her, my feet stumbling as I ran down the stairs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I reached the front door, hands shaking, heart racing, but just as I pulled it open, I heard her voice, sharp and commanding. "You'll never leave." I turned just in time to see Mrs. Archer at the top of the stairs, standing still, a dark shadow enveloping her. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud as I bolted out onto the street. My breath was shallow, my vision spinning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I just kept running. I never went back to that apartment, and I never will. But every once in a while, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it again. The tapping, faint at first, then louder and louder, coming from somewhere deep inside the walls, just beneath my feet. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I hear a voice too. "Let me out."